forward to bringing this event to you. We're glad there's so much enthusiasm for this event. I think we've had the most people ever sign up for this event, so thank you for attending. We will be recording this event, so if you know someone that wasn't able to join live, we will be sending the recording out to everyone in a couple of days, and they will be able to view it then. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of USJET's sponsors, partners, and grantors. In particular, I'd like to thank our funders who directly support these webinars, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnerships, and CLAIR, the Council of Local Authorities for International Relations, that's the Japan local government. Without them, this webinar would not be possible. My name is Casey Neely, and I'm the program coordinator for USJET. We have quite a few new names joining us today for this webinar, so I'm going to explain a little bit about USJET. For those of you who are not familiar with the JET program, it is a competitive opportunity for employment that allows young professionals to live and work in Japan. It is an opportunity to work and represent the United States as a cultural ambassador to Japan. Most participants serve as assistant language teachers in public schools or private schools, K through 12. And some also work as coordinators for international relations, doing interpretation, translation, and other work for local governments. I myself was a JET in Kumamoto Prefecture from 2013 to 2015. Our two speakers tonight were also JETs. USJET's programs support JET alumni, but we also support the 19 US JET alumni chapters that are located throughout the United States. Tonight's event is one of our professional development events. We have monthly webinars. So if you're interested in these types of webinars, I would definitely encourage you to visit our website and follow us on social media. We have a lot of webinars featuring JETs in different industries. In the past, we've had higher education, the legal field, communications, marketing, different fields. We also have a variety of other professional development topics to help you with your job search or life after JET. You can learn more about our programs on our website. Those are in the chat, as well as our social media links. Definitely follow us there. And now I'd like to briefly go over the agenda. Before that, I want to let you know and encourage you to donate to USJET. It helps us to do programs like this in the future. The agenda for tonight is we are going to do introductions of our speakers. We're going to have a panel of questions, and then we're going to go over questions that you have submitted to us in advance. Everybody, when they signed up, should have submitted questions, so we'll go over some of those questions as well. And I hope that you will find all of the answers useful. Now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, I would like to introduce Carolyn Whittingham. She is currently a product market specialist at Nintendo of America. She was also a JET in Hokkaido from 2015 to 2016. Carolyn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I'll just start with a little bit about myself. As Casey kindly mentioned, I'm Carolyn Whittingham. I am currently a product marketing specialist at Nintendo of America. I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica. So if you pick up a little accent, that's where it's from. So I grew up in Kingston, and I was just always passionate about video games ever since I was a really, really young kid. And then as I got older, I realized that many of the video games that I was a fan of came from Japan. So I thought, wow, Japan must be this great place with all of these creative minds, making these awesome products. So I kind of made up my mind as a kid, I want to work in the Japanese media or entertainment business. And that just kind of set my career path from then on. As a teenager, I decided the best way to get involved would be to learn Japanese. So at around age 14, I sent myself to an American boarding school in Andover, Massachusetts, where I could learn Japanese. I studied Japanese for 4 years of high school, studied abroad for the first time in high school, loved it there, decided to major in Japanese. So I looked for a program that was somewhere a little warmer than Andover, Massachusetts, because as I said, I'm Jamaican. So I found a Japanese program at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and I studied Japanese there for 4 years. I also studied abroad while I was in undergrad in Kyoto, Osaka, and in Hakodate in Hokkaido. And then after that, after living in Japan for that year, studying abroad, I thought to myself, I really want to go back and try to find a job there. So that's when I applied to the JET program, and I was successfully placed in Hokkaido, and I spent 2015 to 2016 in Iwamizawashi. After that, I wanted to kind of get closer towards working in the video game industry. So I thought, let me just keep on working on my language skills. So I got a position as the linguist and administrative assistant at the Mitsubishi Aircraft Corporation in Moses Lake, Washington. So again, in a cold place, they just kept on coming. And then after that, I just wanted to get closer to video games, and I built up my linguist experience. So I thought, how can I link this linguistic skills to a position or role in video games? So I found this buzzword that kept coming up, localization. So I started to pursue that. I found that there is one master's program in the entire United States that offers a full program in localization at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. So I applied there to their translation and localization management program. I was successful. They actually have a scholarship for JET Alumni. So if you're interested, I'd suggest you check that out. So after getting that master's degree, I got a job as a localization project manager at a supplier for Toyota. And then while I was in that role, I got the call from Nintendo and applied, and I was successful. So here I am now working in the video game industry. I made the dream come true. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. And now I'm going to introduce Samuel Mullen. Samuel Mullen is currently the Director of International Product Development and Localization at SEGA of America, and was a JET in Hiroshima from 2002 to 2005.
Thank you, Casey. I want to thank Casey and Bahia, and of course Carolyn, for joining us on this. This is a great opportunity. It's always great to meet and connect with JETs in basically any shape and form possible. My name is Sam Mullen. I am like introduced, Director of Localization and sort of international production over in SEGA's Irvine offices down in Irvine, California. I'm originally from South Carolina, from a small town on the border of Georgia and South Carolina. At a young age, my first video game console was an Atari 2600 when I was 3 years old, and the rest is history. I grew up right when Super Nintendo and sort of the famous Japanese RPGs, the Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6 kind of hitting the shores there, and was really influential. And then when I got into school, I actually at that time, it just sort of like Carolyn was saying, like I just sort of kind of realized at one point that, oh, these games that I love to play are actually from Japan. I'd never realized that. It was really around the time when sort of, like the emulation, game and emulation was starting to come online, and we were starting to see these people bringing these games that you'd never seen in Western shores before. And there were people like putting local translation into them and stuff. It was just the most absolutely fascinating thing ever. So through being convinced by a friend of mine, I decided to start studying Japanese. And my first year Japanese professor at Clemson University was just an amazing person, and it like turned my whole. Originally I was like, oh, there's no way I can learn how to read this crazy language. But one thing led to another. After 2 years of study, I switched to a minor in Japanese to add on to my computer science, Bachelor of Arts in Computer Science. I studied abroad for a couple months in Kyoto, came back, finished out my degree, and applied for the JET program, got in. And spent 3 years in Hiroshima, in sort of the mountains of Hiroshima, kind of basically like an hour and a half outside the city, 2 hours outside the city. After that, through a connection, I started working in sort of feature phone mobile games as a game tester at a Japanese company, very small kind of a group, and they needed more sort of bilingual sort of support in their sort of product management sort of section. It was a very junior sort of project management role, but I was able to see some success there, gain some additional language skills as applicable to sort of project management and QA of video games. I leveraged that into another role at competing for another firm, a little small company called Atlus, and then I eventually moved into SEGA from there. So I've been working at SEGA essentially for over a decade now, just slowly scraping my way up the chain, and they let me kind of do important stuff now. So, it is what it is. So I've been in the industry at this point for probably about 15 years since I got back from JET. So I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences and hearing Carolyn's experiences as well today.
That's great. Thank you guys both for introducing yourselves and giving us a little bit about why you got interested in working in the gaming industry and sort of how your path from, JET to your current position went. Can you guys talk a little bit more about your experience on JET, and are there any skills you gained on the JET program that have been useful to you in working in the gaming industry?
I'll go first. So I think the most valuable thing about being a JET at the end of the day that makes the JET experience really kind of special and unique is as far as exposure to Japan is that JET tends to place us in sort of like off the beaten path places. We tend to get often in, not all of us, but some of us are placed in places where you have to have a car, you have to kind of learn how to get around the mountains in certain special ways that I think that exposes us to a certain side of Japan that's not upfront and obvious. I think that gives us a lot of like interesting competitive advantages in all kinds of spaces because we can, there's just a little bit more exposure to like sort of the core of Japan and often what Japan kind of, they themselves think is like the idyllic kind of idea of what their own country can be, which is not necessarily explicitly obvious if you were someone who maybe went directly to Osaka and spent a lot of time in Osaka, went to Tokyo, spent a lot of time in Tokyo. So for me personally, I think that that's one of the most unique aspects of JET that I took away from it, at least.
Sure, yeah, just to go off of that, my experience that I think is most valuable now in my career has got to be communication. And I think a lot of those communication skills that I built up really came from sort of being not necessarily in the middle of a city center hub. So for instance, I was in fairly rural Hokkaido, about an hour and a half outside of Sapporo. So, not completely off the grid, but there was just a certain dialect that was spoken in Hokkaido, the kinds of people that I had to interact with on a day-to-day, I was a elementary school teacher. So I was talking to young children and it was like, okay, well, I speak English, they speak Japanese, neither of us, they're not very good at Japanese, I'm not very good at Japanese yet, and it was how we made those communications. And that taught me just a lot about how to connect with people. And now, in my role as a project manager afterwards, my current position right now, that communication aspect of things is just so key. And just learning how to, do that and have to like do that code switching based on what situation you're in, like coming from a classroom with young children to going back to the staff room to talking to the neighborhood watch grandma, who was always telling me that I was putting out my trash wrong, just learning by doing and being in the culture and, figuring out how to just live and communicate. That was really what I think is the most integral learning that I took away from that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of that context. I think that the exposure to like a deeper context within Japanese culture does really allow you to like connect with when you're working with Japanese colleagues. It allows you to connect with them in sort of a different kind of way. Sometimes they'll say things or they'll take positions, and you're like, you know what? Actually, I kind of get where you're coming from. Because especially for the the JETs who have been through the elementary school, working with the kids, middle schools, and even the high schools. There's a context that I feel like they're familiar with by interacting with the culture and the Japanese population at those age ranges. I think really, especially in the game industry, which is ultimately entertainment, I think it really gives you a lot of context to connect with people on a different level.
Yep, totally agree.
That's great. Yeah, I feel like so many of the skills that you learn on JET, within the classroom, outside of the classroom, just living in the community are translatable to so many different professions. And to that point of communication, the next question, how necessary are Japanese language skills to work in the gaming industry? Does this differ when you're working in the US or Japan or by role? How much have you guys used, Japanese? Do you think it's necessary?
Sure, I can start. So it really depends on the kind of role you're looking for. So I am at my essence a linguist, and that's kind of what my career path was. I was a translator at Mitsubishi. I studied localization, and so I was really always focused on the language side of things. So to get a language focused role, I am a bilingual product marketing specialist, and I do have a bilingual capacity to my job, I needed to have those language skills. However, the video game industry isn't just like, it's not siloed that way. I think we both happen to work with companies that have a Japanese parent company, but there's so many different gaming companies out there that do not have a Japanese parent company. So if your goal is more video games, then you don't necessarily have to know Japanese. And even if you are in a Japanese company, if you're on the stateside or outside of Japan, you could have a role or a job function that doesn't require you to have bilingual skills. It might help to some degree, but it's not a staunch requirement. However, on the flip side, to answer your question about whether it's applicable if you live in Japan, in my JET experience, and I'm sure that there are many others in their own JET experience, drop it in the chat if you're one of these who I have colleagues and knew people who were on JET for many years and never learned a word of Japanese, not a single word, but never really picked up the language. And they were able to live just fine. And so there's a lot of roles, I'm sure, in Japanese gaming companies in Japan where you also don't need to be fully fluent in Japanese to work and function. However, I would caveat that by saying that being bilingual in any language opens your door to being able to communicate with so many other people. And if you're at a company, you're going to be able to build such stronger relationships and more meaningful connections with people if you can communicate in a language that they're comfortable with, or if somebody sees you willing to push yourself outside of your comfort zone to make the effort to speak a language that they're familiar with. So to sum up, it's not a staunch requirement, but I'm sure it's helpful.
So exactly everything that Carolyn just said. I mean, if you're working in an organization that has a parent company, or you have good Japanese skills, there's already you already kind of like a special in there where you can kind of come in and be the grease between the Japanese parent company and the international organization, in multiple different capacities, whether as a project coordinator, marketing specialist, production person, a localization person. All those things are very useful. Those are all very obvious and I think the most visible. But in addition to that, the video game industry is extremely broad in its what we touch. It's not just like, people often think, when I say I'm in the game industry, they're like, oh, are you a programmer? Well, yes, there are programmers actually in the video game industry, but there's also audio engineers. There's 3D modelers. There's 2D graphical artists. There's the guy who analyzes how many clicks the person clicked through a video game page to find out where they're coming from. Like, there's so many different types of roles out there, and whether you're working with an internal Japanese company or working as an external company, as a client of a Japanese or a client of a sub-Japanese company, being on staff and saying, I can speak Japanese, I can connect with this particular client, or at least smooth the communications a little bit and give context, is an incredibly valuable skill. I'm always shocked sometimes how when you bring clients or partners or individuals out of like a completely Western or even American context and drop them into a Japan adjacent context, how it's so much a fish out of water, how there's so much like, oh wow, this person's going to need to be guided into a certain sort of mind space to even have a conversation here. And bilinguals in Japanese space, that's where you can really shine and say, hey, I'm going to try to put these two resources together in a way that wouldn't work otherwise if we didn't have a Japan familiar person in between.
It's really great. It seems like you don't need the Japanese skills, but it can only be an asset if you do have them, which I think is really great. Sam, you talked a little bit about some of the roles within the gaming industry. Localization and project management seem to be common types of position in the gaming industry. Could you talk a bit more about these different positions and any others that are common to the gaming industry so that attendees can learn a little bit more about what types of jobs to look out for? And then there were some people that were interested in that had programming experience. And so maybe talk a little bit about what jobs may be good for those who have that programming experiences, and maybe some jobs that don't require programming experience as well.
Absolutely. So we could definitely have like a 3-hour conversation unpacking like all the different types of stuff you can do in the video game industry. But we have two different people here that I do want to kind of unpack, I think, and Carolyn, I'm going to kind of imagine using, the kind of stuff you do based on my own experience. But we're talking, the people we have here today are essentially publishing side individuals. So there's essentially two aspects of the kind of core aspects of the video game industry. There's the developers who build the games, and then there's the publishers who bring them to market. On the publishing side, there's a couple critical, parts of it. But in this department, this group right here, these floating heads are here, you have the two biggest parts, the production guy and the marketing woman, so those are really what bring, or like the two big sort of functioning actions within, I think, the publishing side. So when it comes to project management, even within that, there's two different types of project. Marketing of a product is a project. Building the product is a project. So both of them have are sort of management roles. So in my space, I definitely want to hear Carolyn talk about what it's like to run a marketing project, because that's its own completely different beast. But on my side, essentially what the function is that, we work with Japan to essentially not only build the game up, make sure that it has funding, make sure that it, they have all the resources they need to create the product to the vision that they have, but more specifically when it comes to international offices, since we have to sell this product into the regions that we're in charge of, which would be, let's just say, not Japan for simplicity's sake. If it's only in Japanese, well, we got to make it to languages that are not Japanese that the local locales understand. So, not only are we managing sort of developer building the project, but on the other side, we have to manage the localization of the game, which means basically taking source text, translating it into whatever the target is, most commonly English. And I think English is probably the most prevalent language being spoken in here. And that requires management of external resources, sometimes internal resources, and making sure that the language is all being managed and all that kind of stuff. So there's and you can have project managers who are specifically onto localization. You can have project managers who are overseeing sort of the overall coordination of international resources, making sure like art for the games being done, making sure that, sometimes like one of the interesting things that I've done in the past is Japanese developer wants to hire a Western talent, but they don't know who to talk to. You get to go out and find the talent. You get to get get some mocap actors that move like Western people and not like Japanese people. Like there's a whole bunch of like different types of relationships you can build around there, where you're managing either, again, just not only just the localization, but also the project and the production as well. And there's completely different paths and different, each section has a million different ways you could get into it. And it just kind of, it's a little more specific about your own specific skill sets, kind of who what your touch points are, and how to get in there. So those are all very, very individual journeys. But again, I could talk forever about that. I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn to talk about the other aspect.
Sure. So I think, Samuel, he really, encapsulates it quite accurately. So at Nintendo too, we also have development that happens almost entirely in Japan, and then publishing, which is kind of what the Nintendo of America's role is. It's how do we take these video games that were developed over in Japan and market them, which is my role, to the North American markets, which are Canada, the US, and Latin America. And so to do so, while project management, marketing is project management in many ways, just like Samuel had mentioned. And then there's just so many other aspects to that. There's sales that goes into it. There's traditional marketing, there's digital marketing, there's social media, there's our legal has to get involved in every step of the way. There's product testing that has to happen. There's localization, there's quality assurance. It goes, on and on and on. So there's so many roles that are available on the publishing side of things. And, you had asked a little bit about programming, and I think I'm just not too knowledgeable about that because I'm not a programmer. I don't have that background, but I would say that on the publishing side of things, it's more about the product testing aspect that you might need to have that technical, programming sort of background. But most of that is going to happen on the development side. So localization, marketing, project management is kind of all rolled up in its own little way, but it's not required, and you don't need to say have a degree in project management like I do. Project management is something that you can get that knowledge on the job doing a varied degree of roles. For instance, if you're an administrative assistant managing somebody's schedule, you're project managing that person's schedule. So, if you're worried about saying, oh, I don't have project management experience, I don't have localization experience, but how do I get my foot in the door in the gaming industry? I think it all just takes a matter of just switching the way of thinking, just like take a little bit more creative approach to what you're doing right now. You know, if you're doing accounts, that's managing the accounts for a project. You know, it's just, there's many different applications of it. So it's not just, you know, X or Y, localization or project management. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in an internship or even in school that applies directly to the roles. So I don't know if Sammy, you want to add anything more about the
yeah, I mean, yeah, often I will say from my personal as a hiring manager myself, like often people are really looking for, like, we can often teach you how to do the things that we need you to do. What companies don't want to have to do is like teach you mindset and like attitude and like go-to-itiveness, and like the willingness to kind of jump into something full body. And honestly, one of the things I you know, one of the things I pinned on jets is by virtue of being a jet, you've already sort of proven that you're willing to kind of jump off the deep end a little bit and do something a little challenging, do something a little bit outside your comfort zone. And I think that's you know, when I'm looking through resumes, jets stand out to me as already having these qualifications. On my team, I off the top of my head, I actually already have like, I want to say 4, maybe 5 jets within my group, my generalized group. And so, you know, there is a presence there, and they, you know, it's good to be a jet because you kind of built in with a lot of the base skill sets that I think companies are looking. It's more about just having the audacity to find a job and be like, I think I can do this. Let me do some basic research on what they're maybe requiring and hit the apply button and just give it a shot.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we've had a couple of people chiming in the chat as well that are also working in the industry, giving advice as well. So I encourage everyone to check that out. Talking a little bit, you guys have gone over sort of the different roles that are, you know, within the gaming industry in large strokes. I know we don't have enough time to cover every single, you know, role and aspect, but could you guys talk a little bit more about the type of work that you do in your current role?
All right, I'll start because yeah. So my background is essentially basic project management and essentially localization. So I work. Not only do I manage localization projects and execute them, I have a long history of working with linguists and translators. I actually, surprisingly enough, fortunately, never actually had to go through the translator sort of route. I was able to kind of like shift in through sort of a weird sort of sneaky sideway, but localization and project management is definitely, you know, essentially international project management is my thing. So on the teams that I generally work with, there's sort of 3 different, or let's say like 4 or 5 different roles. So real basic QA testers, it's a very ground level way of getting in. You know, testers are not necessarily, you can hire testers from all walks of life, but you know, bilingual testers are kind of rare. So you know, that's a good way to stand out. You know, you can, one of the advantages of being a bilingual tester or someone who can read Japanese is you can get in the Japanese database and find issues in there and look those up. You also have like test leads, which is like the next step to a tester, where they kind of step up and they start guiding their own teams. Now you're a project manager on a you know, basic production level thing. So those are 2 aspects. As you move into localization, we have you know, basic translators, and there's a huge like broad range of what localizers and translators can do. Some people are, you know, there's like staff translators who are either translating game text in a more of a creative fashion. You have comms translators who are just like focused on making sure people's emails are not being misinterpreted, who tend to be a bit more staff driven. You have freelancers who essentially, you know, accept outsource work as contractors from localization firms or directly from publishers or developers if they are set up to do that, and the local label laws allow it. And that's another way to kind of get in. And then as you move through it and you become more of like project management localization, either that means moving into outsourced localization firms. There are many with all over the place that you could start with. Either as an outsourced localization manager or an in-house localization manager. And then there's a slight difference between like a localization management position and a localization producer, who's a little bit more kind of like hands into the game itself rather than just making sure the localization happens. So those are all sort of roles, at least on the sort of localization production side, just for starters.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more in-depth into my role. So I'm a product marketing specialist that essentially boils down to I am assigned a product, I become the specialist of that product. So basically the game expert, and then I help our various teams across Nintendo market that product by, being the sort of consultant as the like game specialist or the product specialist. So that's a little bit what my role is in a nutshell. But basically it's this very dynamic role where like no 2 days are ever truly the same. It involves some of my project management background, my localization background, and I have to, support in a bilingual capacity as well with, if we're communicating with the Japan office or if there's documents that need to be translated. If it's marketing related, then that generally goes through somebody on my grander team, whereas the localization section of the work, like the pure localization, is more just the strict translation. So communication sort of works differently, but every gaming company is going to be slightly different in how that functions and how it looks and how that breakdown works. But there are similar roles all throughout. But yeah, it's just generally, we've got writers that focus on just writing any English copy who are not necessarily bilingual. So it just really depends. There's just job functions for many, many, many different capacities. There's writers all across Nintendo in many different, divisions that, support in various ways. But yeah, so that's just a little bit more about what I do. It is essentially a project management role though, where, I'm just helping teams, manage schedules, make sure that people have the right materials that they need to do their job properly, and just supporting as best I can with the knowledge that I have as the product specialist.
That's great. Thank you for talking a little bit more about what you do and then some of the other roles that you maybe interact with. We're gonna go ahead and start answering some of the questions that you all have submitted in advance. Thank you all for submitting questions in advance. We got a lot of repeat questions, so we're gonna try and go over those. And first off, I wanna ask some questions about the hiring process and how to get in to the industry. What would you say was your biggest selling point to the gaming companies that ended up hiring you? Or you can also just talk about, what are some skills or ways to sort of get into the company where you're working now?
I can start. I think that my biggest selling point was how much of a video game nerd I was. Anybody who knows me will tell you that she's the like Pokemon girl. Like I've always been the Pokemon person, like ever since I was a child. Like I've just been a fan of that franchise as long as it's existed, which is in its 25th anniversary year right now. So check out all the really cool things that they're doing. And so I think once I got the interview, which actually I would say is the biggest hurdle into getting your foot in the door in this industry, in my personal experience, it was showing that passion, that just knowledge from the fan perspective, because the knowledge you have as a fan is very different than the knowledge that you'll gain on the job that you'll need to do your job function. But just having, I guess, showing them and like making it very apparent that this was something that I really cared about. It's a part of my life, whether or not it's my profession, I think was really like communicating that element of it was, I think, very important in convincing Nintendo why they should hire me. I mean, aside from that though, you need to have, it's not just a passion. You can't just go in there with like, knowledge from a fan perspective to be able to do the job function. You're also going to need the hard skills as well, and the soft skills. So, in terms of the hard skills, I did have the job experience. I did have the Japanese language background. I did have a localization degree, you know what I mean? So that all helped. And then, but I really think it was, being a excited fan of Nintendo and its IP and being able to communicate that in a way that's, it's just, it goes back to that point I was making earlier about communication and being able to convey your feelings in an effective manner, because that's like, if you're a project manager, 90% of your job is going to be communication. And so if you're in an interview and you can't convey your feelings and your experiences and, you know, even talk about yourself in an effective way, you're not going to be able to talk about yourself. You're not going to be able to talk about your product or, do your job function in an effective way either. So I think for me, it was that passion and that communication skill, in addition to some of my like resume skills, that really, I think, sealed the deal for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I was talking a little bit about, sort of JET's pre-selection, but I think a lot of JETs, by virtue of being there, being kind of put on the spot, there's a lot of, many of us have been tempered by the fires of blank student stares, looking at us, waiting for us to do something compelling. So again, if you can get that interview, just showing up, being ready to like express very clearly, be passionate, be really into what's going on, I think does go a long way. But I think another thing that's really important for like sussing out positions is sort of being available, and making sure that you're somewhat local and like in the area, or you can get there. Sometimes, having a plethora of different sort of experiences, at least on the production side, like having done a little QA work or having done a little bit of freelance work, it's gonna, when you're looking for those entry positions, that's really going to help you. In the game industry, often there's a kind of a need to jump around and do a little bit of like ground level work and kind of build experience. I mean, you can do exactly what Caroline's saying, where you can do the degrees and kind of get up, but there's also another path where you kind of come in, you put the time in, you do the grunt work to kind of just build up a little experience. But the one interesting thing, at least for Japanese companies, is that once you're in, you're pretty good to go, because when it comes to the Japanese game industry specifically, and again, we had previously talked about, there's a huge other ocean of video game jobs out there, VM adjacent jobs. When it comes to the Japanese game industry specifically, it's a bit like a village. And so once you're in, you'll find that over the long term, they will take care of you. You'll find that people move around from company to company. And as long as you're, there, you're showing up, you're putting the hard work in, you'll find that there's kind of always a place for you at the end of the day. But it is sort of important to find that getting that initial like in the door thing, I think, is definitely the most challenging aspect. And that is just literally time, place, and luck. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really great. I guess sort of going off of that, would you guys have any advice for current JETs or anyone that's interested in entering the industry about things they could do to prepare for a job in this industry? Or
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
You're gonna have to be ready to swing out. Like it'll take time. I think that it's a slow start. I think it kind of depends on where you're coming at and what your opportunity is, where you're located, which companies you're applying to, what the state of that company is. It's a very complicated equation. And I don't think that there is any surefire, like, if, for example, if you're like, I got 6 months to get a job and I'm going to move to LA and I'm going to spend 6 months trying to find my job, it might just not be there, and you might swing out. And so there's a definitely sort of a luck of the roll there. But, as with anything, putting yourself out there, making yourself available, looking, taking the interview, swing above your weight, don't be scared, and maybe Lady Luck will shine on you, and you'll end up somewhere that is where you need to be, or is adjacent to where you can get to. I think it's not very helpful advice, but in my experience, that's often how people show up in positions like this. So.
Yep, and just to go off of that, I think, what did you say, Sam? It was time, place, and luck is the lucky triad there. And I think that that's so true. It's like, even if you have all of the building blocks that you need, it just, those circumstances just make up for so much of the decision making. Also, I think another important thing to keep in mind that I struggled with when I was coming right out of graduate school, because I graduated in May. And I said, well, around the March timeframe, I was starting to get really worried about May. Like, I don't have a job after grad school. I really wanted to get into video games. What do I do? And so instead of giving myself some breathing room, I got this opportunity, and it was a good opportunity as a localization project manager. And, I took it, but then I started my interview process with Nintendo literally a month after I started my job then. It just sometimes takes some of the bigger companies more time to get to your application. And sometimes the process just takes months. And so it's just kind of tough. But I guess in terms of what, current JETs or anybody listening in on the panel right now could do to sort of help themselves, I would say that networking and narrowing your focus on what kind of roles you're looking for would be some additional advice that I have. I say networking because that is kind of, like we were both said, just getting that first interview is one of the biggest hurdles. And if you've started to build up connections, whether it's even walking up to, you're seeing like a pop-up store or, there's, Nintendo or Sega has a booth at like, I don't know, a county fair, who knows, going up there and just at least talking, showing your face. If there are like events like these ones, putting your face out there and your name in front of people who can like begin to see and recognize you, go to conferences if you can, if you're, if you're a student or, maybe your company will sponsor you, or there's a lot of scholarships to even attend networking programs and conferences. So these are just different ways. And in terms of my other point about narrowing your focus, if you just say, I want to get into the video game industry, I just want my foot in the door, there's just too much out there. You've got to know, like, am I interested in sales? Do I want to be on the development side? Do I want to be on publishing side? Am I a linguist? Do I want a language focused role? Do I want to be on the business side? Am I, an attorney and want to get into legal? You know what I mean? You just need to really decide what it is. You don't have to like narrow it down to one. Like, I want to be a localization project manager and nothing else, because then you might shoot yourself in the foot. But just have a couple options that really line up with A, your passions, and B, your skill set, and really focus on working on those. And it's like, it's just like what they say with your resume. You need to make sure that your resume is really aligned with the skills for the job that you're applying for. So, so just taper that. That's also part of this narrowing your focus advice. And I think you'll become a lot more effective in eventually landing that interview. And then it's all you from that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really roundabout ways to get to where you're wanting. I'll actually, I don't think he's here, so I don't think he's gonna fuss at me if I call him up. But I have a colleague on my team who's a JET, and after JET, he worked at Bandai Namco in Japan as like in arcade machine sales, like a pretty like entry level kind of just like salesman guy. And from there, he's leveraged that experience into a position that in a function that we internally call publishing, which is essentially like a really internally process management that's more like internal corporate kind of stuff, but not really related directly to the game, but having to do with the game. And it's like one of those positions that would make no sense to anyone outside of it, because it's such like a deep inside kind of thing. But he's worked in that for a little while, and just recently he's transitioned over to the product team, which was ultimately his goal, what he wanted to work on. So he's gone through a couple different roundabout stages to finally kind of be able to be in a position where you can actually sit on top of the product and kind of start working on that thing. So sometimes the route to get to where you're going can be roundabout and non-obvious. And I think even within the game industry, I think that that's probably more the rule than the exception. You'll find that you just have to start kind of stepping in one direction. You'll kind of eventually find your way to where you ultimately need to be. But it is definitely a windy, confusing road at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to, use my own experience. I started with JET, then I went to the heavy industries. I went to Mitsubishi Aircraft, and then I was, went back to school. I went to Toyota, you know what I mean? And then I finally got my foot in the door at Nintendo. And, I love what I'm doing, but, I see my different coworkers and, kind of just to Samuel's early point, once you kind of get into a Japanese company, you don't necessarily you need to start at the role that is your dream role. Once you kind of get there, start working around different people in the company, start to know you start to know them. Maybe, you'll discover a team that you'd like to work with, or somebody who you find to be a really inspiring mentor and you'd like to be on their team. And then it becomes a lot more easier to do that transition once you're there. And then, again, it's like once you're in the industry, it becomes a little bit easier to hop around. Like as soon as I got my job at Nintendo, suddenly I had many recruiters on LinkedIn at different job gaming companies or localization companies suddenly hounding me like, hey, do you want to transfer? Are you interested? And I was like, where were you guys when I was graduating from grad school? You know what I mean? So it's not a straight line almost ever. And if it is for you, fantastic. So happy for you.
Yep. And sometimes it's even like, as far as a company is concerned, it's always safer to move a known quantity into a position, even if they're like not necessarily currently related to that particular situation. So once you get in, you could be in sort of a tertiary role, and as long as you're kind of making yourself available, the hiring manager will be like, you know what, who would be really good for this thing that I need to fill now? So and so from wherever, and then there's a conversation happens, you get transferred, and then that position ultimately has to get fresh blood in it. But maybe that position or maybe that role was more entry level, or was a little bit more sort of like, oh, there's lots of these kinds of people out there, it's a little bit easier to fill rather than the very, very specialized positions. So especially when it comes to bilingual, which often the positions that are filled by bilinguals and multilinguals are like really like, oh god, how are we going to find this person? They need to be able to do this, know this, and speak Japanese. It can be a very interesting conundrum for internal hiring managers.
That's great. I think the point that Carolyn made about networking is so important, not only for gaming, but anything you do. And the JET network is a very strong network, and I would encourage you to connect with other JETs. I also want to mention that we are planning on possibly having a networking session for JETs interested in gaming at a future date. And we'll send more information about that in the email when we send the recording and everything, but definitely look out for that. That'll be a good chance to network. Going off networking, I want to ask you, what are some ways to grow your network and find a mentor in the field? And then also, how can people connect with you guys as well?
I think it goes back to, I guess, my point about narrowing your focus, because there are, I think, gaming specific organizations and conferences and events you can go to where you will meet industry professionals. There's, the game development conference. There's, I don't even know if E3 is open to the public anymore, but there are various different events that, are available to people that, and even just walk-ups, like there's Nintendo has our merchandise representatives that, go around to like local GameStop sometimes, or, local events. So it's, you can start going there, but you can also look at those specialized sort of ways to get in. For example, I volunteer with an organization called Women in Localization, which is just a localization specific network. By the way, if you're interested in women in localization, it's not only open to women. That's just the name of the group based on, the founders. But I digress. They've got their own job board. They have a mentorship program that I actually spearhead. And you can find mentors in that pool who are localization professionals in gaming. So, it's not always like, if you type in like gaming localization mentor, it might not be like the first pop-up on Google, but there are different ways. So, if you're, a business major, there might be business professionals in gaming, or, sales or marketing conferences where you might be able to find people who are involved. So, it just really depends on like your own journey and like how you're trying to get in. Like, again, you said there's JET. We're a giant network with a lot of people who, feel very passionate about alumni and people who have been through this. And, there's that instant ability to relate to somebody who's gone through a program that you've been through. So, if you find someone at your local chapter, or, a local chapter of any other organization that you're in, that might be one way to, help broaden your network.
Yeah, I think networking is definitely a pretty big challenge, and it does really go back to what Carolyn was saying about kind of knowing your focus. So I think it's kind of, there's a lot of people who reach out and be like, hey, I'm just random person, I want to get a game job, what do I do? And there's a lot of those. And I think it's important about when you're reaching out to a particular the firm or individuals in the firm to kind of connect, you need to have something a little bit more specific about what you're talking about, than just being like, hey, I'm fishing for work. So JET is a great way to kind of as an icebreaker, and there are tons of us in the industry. So and I think most of us we're very willing to connect on, and swap stories about days of old when we were all like slumming around whatever city doing whatever back in the day. So but definitely kind of focusing on like advocacy groups or groups of people who are working on in specific spaces. LinkedIn has tons of these. Connecting on like the International Game Developers Association. There's a North American Translators Association that's a good place to start with localization as well. And yeah, just kind of looking around, taking notes, spending the time to kind of look around and find, if there's other people in your space, as best you can. Yep.
That's great. And I'll add, there's great links within the chat. The group that Carolyn was talking about, Women in Localization, is there. As well, I would encourage you guys to become members of USJET because we are always sending out events where you can make those connections and network. And I would also encourage you all to connect with your local USJET chapter because they will have more regionally specific things in terms of, looking for jobs, networking events, and things like that. So I would definitely encourage everyone to do that. Switching gears a little bit, could you both talk a little bit about the work culture within the industry and the work-life balance in the industry?
All right, so yeah, I manage a lot of people, and I could probably talk about this. So it really depends on the company, because every company culture is completely different. I think that working with Japanese companies comes with, there's a lot of like complexity that comes with that, but at the same time, I also think that a lot of the big Japanese game publishers are also sort of like, they really do make an effort to try to be good corporate citizens and set standards, because they understand that trickles down not only within their personal space, but also the the international space as well. In general, I have to admit that I think the video game industry just as a whole does have a little bit of a work-life balance kind of problem. It's it would be dishonest of me to say that that's not an issue. But I also think that a lot of hiring managers are trying to be very hyper aware of that. You should, if you're applying to a position, it's something you should ask. You should try to figure out what they think about their own work-life balance. That said, when you work in the Japanese space, there is sometimes you just got to dig in. I think working with Japan does come with a lot of, you got to work late sometimes because Japan just woke up, and it doesn't matter if you started working at 9 o'clock in the morning. They're up now and they're asking you questions. And you have to draw lines with that. You have to ask what your supervisor, where they draw the lines at. Those are all great questions to ask. But it just comes down to certain people like to work really hard and they like to work long hours. But it is kind of ultimately the manager's sort of a job to kind of set those lines, be like, this is the expectation of the team. And those are all things that you need to ask if you're applying to a position on a case-by-case basis. I think it really comes into play. Is it a hourly paid position or is it a salary position? Salary positions tend to, there's expectations that you're going to work, and you have to kind of, again, have to dig in on that. Hourly positions tend to have more hyper-managed work times because there's impacts to that for planning purposes. But again, it can be very situational and very company and even departmentally specific.
Right. I can echo pretty much everything that Samuel just mentioned, but I would actually have to say, of the post-JET 3 Japanese companies that I worked for, I actually have the best work-life balance at Nintendo of all of them. So, but that is just if you're working with a Japanese company, just a consideration, not only because of time zone, but just because of just the work culture. I think it also really depends too on the management, because if if the management is Japanese, even if you're on the state side, there's a lot of that mentality that will filter in, and because that is just their culture and that is just their approach to work and the way they've functioned their entire professional life. So if you're in a like American subsidiary of a Japanese parent company, but it's American managed, you might have a slightly different experience. But in terms of other questions to ask, to also ask about in terms of like what to ask HR, ask them about what your pay time off is in your first year and how that may adjust with the longer you've spent at that company, because that's a big deal too. Sometimes it's not as transparent until you actually get the benefits package and you're like, wait, what? So I would ask that upfront as well. And then just, be very clear about, if any, like if you can talk to somebody in the company, ask them about what their overtime experience is like, if any at all. I would also recommend, but I think just in generally, based on my experience, the way it tends to go is that if you have work to do, the expectation is that you do the work no matter how long it takes, especially if you're if you're leading up to a game launch or a game announcement or an event, you need to have the expectation that you probably are not going to be able to sign off right at the time you need to sign off. And of course, that depends to what your level of responsibility is or what your job function is. If you're doing a job that like you really, if you're the social media person and you've just got to click go, but if you've got to click go at Japan time or Europe time, you might have to be up at 5 a.m, but then you might be able to just sign off at night because your schedule is set and no one else is going to call on you until the next day. So those people might be able to just like leave right at the end of the day. But if you are like the product specialist assigned to something, you might be kind of on the hook to see it through no matter how long it takes. Or, if you're right up to announcement, but then afterwards you might have some leeway because it's not so much. So there's just a lot of, it's not really unpredictability because you generally know what's coming, fingers crossed, but there's no like real across the board, every day is going to look the same, you're going to work the same hours in this industry at all. But again, that'll depend on your role and your responsibilities.
Yes, I mean, if you're really engaged on an international Greece kind of situation, coordination, whatever, and you're working in a Japanese firm, Japanese publisher more specifically, and you have multiple offices, I think I have a work fantasy of one day actually working a job where the work stops at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. But in my entire career, I sign off, but then the emails just they keep coming, and the work doesn't pause until I get back in and I have to catch up on 12 hours of things that have happened so I can handle the next 8, 9, 10 hours of work on my side. So it's video games, international production, communications, international launches. It is a nonstop clock, and that's part of the thrill. That's living the dream. That's kind of what it is. So you have to walk into the industry with a little bit of expectation that it's a hot seat.
And then just to add one last note to that, it really also depends on you. I am a workaholic. I am a workhorse, and I will burn the midnight oil, and that is not always a good thing. And if you're at a less ethical company, they might take advantage of that if they notice it. So you also need to be very conscientious of setting boundaries for yourself. Like, yes. Even if you cut off at 6, you might see a couple of emails trickle in, but you've got to know that cutoff point. If somebody gives you a high importance, exclamation point, okay, maybe it's all right to deal with. But, if you're in bed winding down, don't jump out of bed immediately because you've got another email and sign back in. You have to set those boundaries for yourself, which is a constant learning process, at least for me anyways. And I'm still working on it.
Yeah. I had one of my early expenses at Sega was that they issued me a BlackBerry. And I was like, "Woo, this is fancy! Oh, look at me! I can now do all this." And it took me a while to figure out like I need to not look at the thing, not look at my work email after a certain time, because I discovered that I had a hard time winding. It's caused me issues winding down. So I definitely I think it's important for anyone who works in international situations to draw boundaries on off time. It also, you can potentially, when working with Japan, especially, you can sometimes send the wrong signal that if you respond to an email at like 10:30 at night, then they're going to be like, oh, well, he does that. So and now you set an expectation, and now it's like a thing you can't pull back once you've let out of the box. So when you're working with international firms, and I think this is part of what the JET experience works, you do need to be very careful with what you're saying, because it can be heard in a different way that you meant it to say, hey, I'm going to do you a favor, but they heard it as, oh, that's how this person works. So making sure those boundaries are set and consistent is really important. But at the same time, kind of go back to, what Carolyn was saying, like we got to get the work done sometimes. And we're all here for the product. We're here to get the product to market, make the fans happy. So everyone gets we get the Metascore clicks and the likes and all that kind of stuff. That's what we're out here for. So we have to prioritize the product, but you also have to prioritize yourself as well. And finding that balance is incredibly important.
That's great. That's good to know, and important questions to ask. Since we're running a little bit on time, we'll ask 2 last questions. And then we will wrap up. Carolyn, this one's for you. Could you talk a little bit about what it's like for women and minorities working within the industry?
Oh, fun. So, yeah. Well, I'll talk a little bit first about my Nintendo experience, just saying that at Nintendo, I felt nothing but supported. I, see like there are many different women in my own department, and they are, and minorities, and they have management position, like level roles. Nintendo's executive team has women and minority, people from minority backgrounds in the executive leadership as well. In addition to that, we have things like employee resource groups, that are based on a variety of different demographics, not necessarily just gender or race, but orientation, just like interest groups, et cetera. So there is a lot of support built into that. That being said, I will say that generally speaking, in the gaming industry, there are not a lot of people I feel that look like me. So that's just as an industry thing as a whole. And so if that's something that's daunting for you, or that you'd like to see more of, I think, it's important to speak up about that, to like let your voice be heard as far as, to the degree to which you're comfortable with doing so. But, and I think that's also important to not just, keep, like, if you can, bring it up to people who have the power to do something about it, like hiring managers, or if you've got things like employee resource groups like we do, we bring up those topics. And so we can start to see some more change in the industry. And that is also why I want to go out here and put myself out there and talk at these events to, try and like show people like that this kind of face does exist in this industry. And we are, we are here, we are, giving back in our own ways. We are functioning. They do want us, and so I think that's part of the reason why I'm here doing this as well. So yeah, that's just a little bit about that. Do you want to add anything, Samuel, in your experience? Maybe not. It's fine.
I'm a little hesitant to step into this one. Just owing to
right.
like I know when I'm about to put up a foot in my mouth, so I'm a little hesitant to kind of come and comment. I will say that at least on my team, when it comes to minorities and women in the industry, as a hiring manager, I do my best to bring in a diverse crowd, and I think we have a lot of different types of people on our staff as well, and it's definitely something that localization specifically is incredibly important to have a diverse team with all kinds of different viewpoints, because when you're delivering content out of Japan into a multinational sort of situation, having all kinds of people being able to look at it and be like, something about this doesn't quite strike me as right, or is this a bad take on this localization? Japan is meaning this, but it's coming out this way. What do we do? How can we, not, one of the biggest things we want to avoid is any kind of like censorship, but we're also not really wanting to like set people off for the wrong reasons. So having a diverse staff is always something that I think, at least in my firm and on my team, is something we strive for, and it's something incredibly important. So.
Yeah, and just to go off of that, it's like the video game industry, part of it's what makes it so great and makes it so popular and makes people so interested in it, and which is why I think we have so many participants even in this room, is that we create products that are universal. You know, there's no, like, anybody and everybody can and does enjoy video games. And so I really do think it's important for creators to have the input of the people that are going to be consuming the product. But, you know, to add to that, I think that experience also differs quite a little bit of, like, depending on the kind of gaming company it is. For instance, if there is a Japanese parent company, if you're going to look at, like, broad demographics across the entire company, then of course it's going to skew more Asian, because, you know, that's just how it looks. So, you know, if for many, like, American-based gaming companies or European, or just, you know, that demographic breakdown is gonna look very different, depending on just where the headquarters is, or, you know, what the group is. Like, if you're in Latin America, it's gonna look very different as well. So, you know, if you're looking for a place in the industry for you, you might not be able, you know, it might not be, you know, one of the big ones. It might be a smaller niche group, or a smaller indie developer. You know, it really just depends. But, you know, in terms of that, what I was saying earlier about we make products for a variety of people, and so it needs to appeal to a variety of people. You know, that gaming companies, I think, have gotten better about that as the years have gone by. You know, like Samuel had said, we're trying to avoid censorship at all costs. But even, like, in Nintendo, I am part of a group that is, you know, they ask, the developers in Japan will send us, you know, something, and ask us to weigh in on how we think this would like affect how it would play out in the American market. Exactly. And the reason I'm involved in that panel isn't because I am a woman of color. It's, you know, that team is a very broad team, but the fact is that they're asking those questions. They're asking their, you know, American subsidiary company, like, how is this going to look in your region? How is this going to come across? And they do the same for Europe. You know, like, there was a situation that I can think of where there was, you know, a religious iconography that was in a game that, you know, Japan didn't even flag it, but it was caught in the European office, and even the American office didn't quite catch it, because it means something differently in Europe than it does in America. And so that's, I think, what's also very important about having not only people locally that are from diverse backgrounds, but also, if you can, having satellite locations sort of all around the world, and having different types of people who can give input.
Yeah, like one of my favorite like weird flags that, like, is a great example of, like, things that America would not necessarily catch, is it's something that popped up early in my career, where, you know, what's the highest rank that you can get in a Japanese game? Well, it's S. Well, what's better than S? SS. What's better than SS? SSS, which means nothing to us, but in Europe, that's basically like having a rank that's like KKK or something crazy like that. And the Japan never would be like, well, it's one step higher than SS. And Europe's like, please, like, let's not do that. So then, but that doesn't get caught until, like, really far down the thing. So things like that, you need to have a diverse team of people with all kinds of different, looking out for stuff that, you know, different people catch, because there's no one person can't know it all at one time, for sure.
There's some great thoughts. Thank you guys for sharing that. Before I do my last question, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to be sending out the recording for this. So please look out for that in your email. And just to tell you a little bit about our upcoming events, we will be having a networking session, which we will release a date for at a later time. And we will also be having a miso ramen cooking class that will be on June 2nd, if anyone is interested in that, as well as we have a Japanese reading club that we have every second Tuesday of the month. The next one is on May 11th, and we have a group on Facebook for that. So if you're interested in any of those events, I would definitely tell you to check them out. The links for those events are also in the chat, but you can go to our website or follow us on any social media, and you will be able to see those events as well. As for our last question, before that, I want to thank Carolyn and Sam. Thank you so much. This has been very insightful, and I don't know if you guys have been seeing the comments and things in the chat, but people find it very useful and eye-opening. So thank you so much. As for our last question, do you guys have any last tips for people who want to transition to this field? from another field or from JET that you can leave everybody with?
I think if you're transitioning from another field, it's just about finding your kind of niche within this side where your current skills can be applicable. I think that you'd be surprised about how far that can take you. So go find different firms, look at their careers page, look at their LinkedIn page, look at check out Indeed and see what you can find. And if you see anything that's even remotely adjacent, just swing for it. You never know. Coming in as a bilingual speaker, I think will actually it's surprising a lot of people, and I think you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. So don't hesitate. Don't worry about if you can. Worry about if you can once you get the job.
Right. I mean, I think, just my own experience, I went from being on JET to being an administrative assistant, got promoted to being a translator, went back to school, started as a localization project manager outside of grad school, got promoted to being a senior project manager, and then I got noticed, you know what I mean? So it's not to say it's impossible because I've done it, you know what I mean? So, like Samuel had said, just look for kind of these adjacent roles and just different ways to maybe even think about applying. Like, if applying directly to the company isn't showing you any results, maybe you need to do some resume sifting, but also you might be able to find roles at like any of these companies through contracting agencies. It might not necessarily be like you're a direct hire. You might have to start working in contract, maybe not even being contracted by the company itself, and then maybe there's a direct hire position, or maybe not even, you just start in your contract role and then, you make enough of an impact where they're like, we want you. So there's that. There's also internships are, I think, a great way. Nintendo has started opening internships, I think 2018 was the first summer they started doing internships. So they've got an internship program now too. So there's just different options and ways you can think about applying. So that's just an additional suggestion I'd have, but just really try to focus, I think, on your skills and what you want out of it, and just cast the net. Swing wide, as you say.
I think the agency actually one is really critical. I have seen a lot of people coming from agency to publishing or to the game side, and then go back and forth. Those are kind of good exchanges. So one thing you could potentially do is look at that's where game credits come into play. Look at which firms various North American outsource for things for like localization or advertising or asset creation. Just look through those and see which companies are being used. They're not that many at the end of the day. They're a lot, but they're not like, there's not thousands and thousands of them. So I think that's a good place to kind of start. And at the very least, once you kind of move up in there, you start making introductions. I hired a localization PM in from a firm because the individual had been managing some of our projects on the vendor side through FIGS localization. And we brought the individual on because they were crazy good. And we're like,
Yoink. Yeah. So, and just to go off of that too, sometimes it's the vendor, get a role at a vendor position, because there's many ways you can get noticed, and that's not only in like localization, although there are many gaming specific localization vendors or groups that work with larger companies, or not even larger. Keywords is one of them. Terra Localizations is another, and then there are if. For instance, Nintendo works with production companies that help them do, create physical models, that help them do advertising, voice acting. There's a lot of ways. And if you just start, showing that you have that connection by working with like a company that they already know and trust and have relationships and contracts with, that could also be helpful. But like Samuel had said, if you stay longer, get more involved, start working your way up the ladder, start just getting even noticed, that might be another way to get your foot in the door as well. Yeah. Again, networking.
Yeah. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for tonight. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Sam and Carolyn, for doing this. This was really great. Thank you for giving us your insight. And we hope to see everyone at a future USJET AA event and connecting with USJET AA. Thank you, everyone.